When you first meet people these days, they often ask you questions as sort of a dance to figure out whether you and they are on the same page on issues that are important to them. Once, I remember meeting some Christians while I was traveling in Europe, and they were asking me my name and where I'm from, and then they sort of casually asked, "Oh, do you speak in tongues?" They were charismatics, so I took that to mean, like, are you one of us or are you not? People might ask you questions designed to figure out whether or not you guys root for the same sports team. How about the Leafs this year? Or they might ask questions that are really probing to find out where you stand politically. Can you believe what's going on with the government? This is all part of our natural tendency to sort ourselves into us and them, into those we identify with and those we consider outsiders, or, in our increasingly fractious times, into the camps of friends and enemies. Presently, we're experiencing a time of great polarization, greater polarization than people have known in several generations. Yet the tendency to see others who aren't like me as a threat is a constant part of human nature, going back to all peoples at all times and all places. Tribalism, it seems, goes back to when people lived in tribes. But Jesus asks those who follow him to set aside this tendency so that his people, the church, can be a community that is open to all people. But you can imagine how this call to be inclusive, which cuts against the grain of the dominant culture, can ruffle some feathers. We're going to see an example of this from the story of Paul as we continue looking at his life. Last week, we looked at Paul's long stay in Ephesus. This week, I want to look at what happens after his missionary journey and he returns to Jerusalem. When he arrives there, the elders in the church are concerned that a misunderstanding about Paul's ministry among the Gentiles might stir up controversy in the church. Controversy in the church, imagine that. It is reported that Paul has been telling Jewish believers to abandon their practice of Jewish religious and cultural customs. This is a mischaracterization. Paul has been saying that Gentiles are not obligated to observe the law in order to be a part of the church. This is not the same thing as telling Jews that they must abandon observing the law. Although Paul has attacked some Jewish practices, incidentally ones that are not commanded by the Torah but are cultural customs, he does so because they serve as roadblocks to the unity of the church, like the unwillingness of Jews to eat with Gentiles. James, Jesus' brother and the leader of the church in Jerusalem, has an idea about how Paul can show that he's not hostile to Jews observing the law. In the church, there are 4 men undergoing a vow of purification. In order to do that, they have to shave their heads, and a week later they have to come and offer sacrifices. And he suggests that Paul join them in taking that vow and pay their expenses. So they go and they get their heads shaved, and while they're waiting for that week to pass so that they can offer the sacrifices, things take an unexpected turn. Read with me in Acts 21, 27-36. When the 7 days were nearly over, some Jews from the province of Asia, that's where Ephesus is located, saw Paul at the temple. They stirred up the whole crowd and seized him, shouting, "Fellow Israelites, help us! This is the man who teaches everyone everywhere against our people and against our law and this place. And besides, he has brought Greeks into the temple and defiled this holy place." They'd previously seen Trophimus, the Ephesian, in the city with Paul and assumed that Paul had brought him into the temple. The whole city was aroused, and the people came running from all directions. Seizing Paul, they dragged him from the temple, and immediately the gates were shut. While they were trying to kill him, news reached the commander of the Roman troops that the whole city of Jerusalem was in an uproar. He at once took some officers and soldiers and ran down to the crowd. When the rioters saw the commander and his soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. The commander came up and arrested him and ordered him to be bound with 2 chains. Then he asked who he was and what he had done. Some in the crowd shouted one thing and some another, and since the commander could not get at the truth because of the uproar, he ordered that Paul be taken into the barracks. When Paul reached the steps, the violence of the mob was so great that he had to be carried by the soldiers. The crowd that followed kept shouting, "Get rid of him." So Paul has been trying to show that he's still a faithful Jew, albeit one who accepts that Jesus is the Messiah. But his presence in the temple offends those who feel it's their job to make sure that the community is pure. The dispute here reflects a deep growing divide in Judaism that has been growing since the time of Alexander the Great, about 350 years before. Alexander and his conquering armies brought Greek or Hellenistic culture with them. Some Jews embraced this culture with its philosophy and architecture and poetry, and some of the Jews were so attracted to this that they abandoned their Jewish faith and identity entirely, trying to become just like the Greeks. Some went so far as to try and undo their circumcision. Many other Jews had no intention of abandoning their Jewish identity, but they still had no choice about engaging Greek culture. Because in the first century, the majority of Jews lived outside the traditional homeland in diaspora communities in places like Alexandria, Antioch, Corinth, and Ephesus. In the major cities where the exiles live, Greek was the common language and a culture. That's why the New Testament is written in Greek. It's in this context, then, that they have to ask, what does it look like to be a faithful Jew, who would be regarded as insiders by other Jews? And unsurprisingly, there was not a unanimous answer to that question, but as a general consensus, three practices, ones that separated Jews from their pagan neighbors, became boundary markers to show who the faithful Jews were and who they weren't. And those markers were circumcision, Sabbath observance, and the kosher diet. Now, the controversy surrounding Paul's missionary work, interestingly, is less about the fact that he promotes Jesus as the Messiah, and more about who Jesus' people are welcoming into the fold. Paul has been evangelizing among the Gentiles, telling them that they can follow God without observing the Torah, the Jewish law. He doesn't require Gentiles to fit into the cultural and religious boundaries that marked out God's people before. In welcoming Gentiles into communion, Paul is not just caving to Greek cultural demands. Instead, he's making a he's making a theological point that he unpacks in his letter to the Ephesians. In Ephesians 2:11-19, he says this: "Therefore, remember that formerly you who were Gentiles by birth and called uncircumcised by those who call themselves the circumcision, which is done in the body by human hands. Remember that at that time you were separate from Christ, excluded from citizenship in Israel, and foreigners to the covenants of the promise, without hope and without God in the world. But now, in Christ Jesus, you who were once far away have been brought near by the blood of Christ. For he himself is our peace, who has made the two groups one and destroyed the barrier, the dividing wall of hostility, by setting aside in his flesh the law with its commandments and regulations. His purpose was to create in himself one new humanity out of the two, thus making peace, and in one body to reconcile both of them to God through the cross, by which he put to death their hostility. He came and preached peace to you who are far away, and peace to those who are near. For through him we have access to the Father by one Spirit. Consequently, you are no longer foreigners and strangers, but fellow citizens with God's people and also members of his household." Through Jesus' death, those outside the law and those inside the law-abiding community can be joined together. The renewed Israelite community is not defined by the old badges of covenant membership, badges like circumcision, Sabbath observance, and the kosher diet. Rather, it is defined by a relationship to Jesus through faith. The conflict between Paul and the Jewish religious authorities comes down to one of identity. Who is us and who is them? In order to examine that question, we have to ask two other questions. First, who do we define as an insider and an outsider? And second, how then should we relate to those who are on the outside? One of the best tools we have to discuss the first question is a mathematical concept called sets. This is really about categorizing things that are in and out. So an example, if I say pick a number between 1 and 10. Well, of course there's a number, but I've already created a set, a series of possible answers of which 4 is a part and which 12 is not. This is called a bounded set, where a clear boundary marker, in this case the number 10, separates what is inside from what is outside. Bounded sets help us define not just numbers, but also groups of people. I can create boundaries that define groups, such as people who hold Canadian citizenship, or biological females, or people who wear glasses. But sometimes we create sets of people who get preferential treatment, like my friends, my family, or my people. The Jews opposing Paul have created a set, God's people, and they define it according to those 3 old criteria: circumcision, Sabbath, kosher diet. What they're teaching is that if you have all of these 3 things, if you are like them in these 3 ways, then you're good. And if you aren't like them, or if you teach other people not to be like them, then you're not welcome here. Because Paul champions the inclusion of people who don't fit into the boundaries of the set, he's seen as an enemy. It's our natural instinct to divide the world into us and them by easily defined boundaries, and we often carry this tendency over into our faith. I want to reflect on how I understood us and them in my younger days, formed in a different church community. Now, to be fair to the church that I grew up in, what I'm going to say is about what I took away from the church, not necessarily what the pastor would have identified as his teaching from the pulpit. It was shaped both by the teaching that I heard, as much as I understood it, and also by the attitudes and the behaviors modeled by other people in my church community. In that context, we was evangelical. And by that, we meant that we believed the Bible and that our primary duty as Christians was to tell people about Jesus. Believing the Bible meant reading it as an absolutely literal document, and of course, following what we thought were the obvious and uncontestable teachings of the Bible on hot-button political issues like abortions, gays, and evolution. And mainline Protestants and Roman Catholics, and of course people of any other faith, were them, and they were probably all going to hell. When the boundaries that define something have such high stakes, people are very keen to patrol them. So if someone in my church believed, say, that evolution was okay, or questioned the orthodoxy that gay people were people who were living in conscious rebellion against God, then their position in the us group was suspect. People spent a lot of time making sure that people knew that they needed to stay on the right side of boundaries, and if someone refused to stay on the inside of those boundaries, they would be considered subversive and be ridiculed or avoided. While the criteria that we use to sort out insiders from outsiders looked very different from the Jews of Paul's time, the effects are the same. God's people becomes a club for people who look and think the same as I do. Diversity from such a body is completely eliminated because it is not tolerated. Boundaries, though, are not the only way to define a set. A centered set isn't defined by external boundaries, but by a relationship to the center. So, for example, we might create 2 sets of motorists: people who are driving toward Kirkland Lake, the center, and people who are driving away from Kirkland Lake, the center. So somebody northbound on 11 coming from Barrie, even though they're a long way away from Kirkland Lake, would be on the coming toward us set. Well, someone who is in King Kirkland driving east towards the Quebec border would be on the driving away from Kirkland Lake set. The centered set gives us a way to think about this insider-outsider distinction in the Christian faith. If Jesus is the center, those moving toward him are a part of the set, and those moving away from him aren't a part of the set. So it's not about where you are right now, it's about where you're headed. From Paul's perspective, a person could be a faithful Jew by the definition that the Jews used, but not necessarily be included in God's people. People like that could faithfully observe Jewish festivals. They could circumcise their children. They could exclusively eat kosher food. They could refuse to lift a finger from sundown on Friday to sundown on Saturday. If those people, though, rejected Jesus as Lord, all of those cultural practices designed to keep them in good standing as God's people were meaningless. At the same time, Gentile outsiders could be included, even if they didn't eat kosher, even if they weren't circumcised, and even if they treated Saturday as if it was the same as any other day, but they accepted that Jesus is Lord, and they tried to orient their lives according to his teaching. In church communities, we might be tempted to avoid insiders and outsiders by boundaries. We might ask questions like, do they go to church every Sunday? Can they recite the Lord's Prayer from memory? Do they know the order of the books of the Bible? Do they avoid those or do they smoke, drink, and chew and go around with girls who do, or do they not do those things? But a person can tick all the right boxes, but still not accept Jesus as Lord. Maybe they're even cool with him being Savior. But when it comes to making him Lord, to organizing their lives around his teaching, they may balk. I've known people who were church people that ran businesses that treated their employees exploitatively. I've known church people who were contemptuous of those who didn't believe as they believed. I've known church people who say that they're seeking God's kingdom while trying to cultivate self-serving power over others. So determining who's an insider and an outsider is not the simplest thing. It's not always as easy as we'd like it to be. As Jesus said, many who are first will be last, and many who are last will be first. It's not always obvious who's on the right track and who's on the wrong track with God. If the church is defined by an orientation towards Jesus rather than by obvious boundaries, how ought this to affect our behavior? Well, first, we need to have the humility to understand that we don't always know someone standing before God. Only God truly knows a human heart. So we can't write somebody off as a hopeless case because they don't look the way that you expect Christians to. As an example, I think that going to church is a good practice, and I highly recommend it. Might be because my livelihood is tied up in that, but you know. But not everybody who stays home from church this Sunday is on the outs with God. And not everybody who comes is heading towards him. Jesus does explain that we can judge a tree by its fruit. As a general principle, people whose lives promote flourishing seem to be on the right track, and people whose lives create enmity and division might not be on the right track. But this sort of judgment isn't about condemning others. Really, it's knowing who to trust or imitate. I'd rather personally seek the advice of a person whose interactions seem to build people up, rather than a person who might know all the right answers, but whose life leaves a trail of broken relationships behind them. Second, it changes who we welcome. If a person becomes a Christian by following certain practices like Bible reading, church attendance, frequent prayer, then our efforts at sharing our faith should focus on those who seem closest, people who occasionally come to church, let's say, the Christmas and Easter crowd. But if a person becomes a Christian by orienting themselves towards Jesus, then those who are far off can just as easily turn to God. Sometimes they're more likely to turn to God. Jesus warned the Pharisees and the tax collectors, Jesus warned the Pharisees that the prostitutes and the tax collectors, people whose behavior placed them outside of the community of faithful Jews, were going to enter the kingdom ahead of them. If the church is defined by conformity to a standard of behavior, then those people who are outside have a long way to travel before they can come inside. But if the church is defined by the direction of travel, everyone, no matter where they find themselves, is one turn away from Jesus. So maybe our own metaphorical prostitutes and tax collectors aren't as far away as we might imagine. Since the insider-outsider distinction isn't so obvious, and also because Jesus tells us to love our enemies, we need to consider how we act towards those who are on the outside. The Jews who attacked Paul at the temple assumed that he was welcoming in those who had no business among God's people. They interpreted his hospitality towards outsiders as hostility towards insiders, claiming Paul preached against the Jewish people, the Jewish law, and the Jewish temple. Well, Paul didn't preach against any of these things, but he did see that God was opening a door to those who weren't direct descendants of Abraham, who weren't culturally Jewish, and who didn't worship at the temple. Paul refused to go along with the idea that God belonged to Jews such as himself. Likewise, we must avoid the temptation to treat those unlike us as our enemies. Our love for those outside is meant to point to Jesus. No matter where we are now, we all started as sinners on the outside. God chose to love us while we were his enemies, and we became his friends merely by responding to that love. Everyone who is presently an outsider shares our story. God loves them, and Jesus died for them. By acting lovingly towards them, we show them who God is, allowing them to respond to God's love. When we act contemptuously, we misrepresent God to the world. How many people have rejected God not because they don't love God, but because they don't love the corrupted vision of God that they see in his people? So what does it look like to put this into practice? It can mean looking for ways to build friendships with people who aren't Christians. The Jews in Jesus' day, fearful of a repeat of their exile experience, pursued a form of righteousness without concern for outsiders. A righteousness without love, if you will. Might be that they would say, if the rest of the world never knows God, that is a price we are willing to pay in order to make sure that we are never again tempted into the kinds of behaviors that might lead to a repeat of our exile. When our primary goal is righteousness, divorced from any obligation to love the outsider, we might reason that we should limit our exposure to the corrupting influence of sinful people. Of course, there are times when we should stay away from people whose influence might derail us. So, for example, if you are a recovering alcoholic, it might be wise to give it a break when spending time with your old drinking buddies. But this is the exception, not the rule. Righteousness doesn't avoid sinners. They follow Jesus' example of seeking the outsider. Living holy while we're spending time with people who aren't like us can be challenging. But if we aren't loving others, then our faith is reduced to morality, and it's a shallow substitution for holiness and righteousness. Holiness isn't about avoiding bad behavior. It actually drives us to reach out in love. So we must build bridges to those who don't know God's love. This could be through simple things like participation in sports teams, karate lessons, or community theater, to name a couple of examples. These can give us a chance to spend time with people who might not know Jesus, to incarnate Jesus' hospitable presence among those who don't normally go to church and therefore don't encounter him in this way. We must be present and we must be different. Paul was present, bodily located in Ephesus and Corinth, but Paul also lived in a distinctly Christian way while he was there, engaging with those who didn't believe. When people get to know us outside of church, do they see the difference that Jesus makes in our lives? While also sensing that we don't hold them in contempt for not being like us. If we follow Jesus' example, imitated by Paul, people who are far away will get a chance to respond to God's love because they will see God's love modeled in his people. Paul ran into trouble because he understood that God doesn't draw dividing lines the way that we do. He understands that entering the kingdom of God isn't about where you are, but about where you're headed. Consequently, many people who seemed close were actually far away, and many people who seemed far away were brought close. We are those who have been brought near. In light of this, how much more ought we to embrace the hospitality of God that welcomes others as we have been welcomed? God doesn't respect our barriers. He breaks them. He loves you too much to let them get in the way. He loves them too much to let them get in the way. no matter who they are. Because Paul serves a barrier-breaking God, he likewise breaks down barriers. So as we serve this same God, let's remember that while building walls may feel natural to us, smashing them down to love those on the outside is what God is doing, and we need to be right there by his side doing the same thing.